Welcome, John, back to SENSESPACE.
It's great to be here again, Jacob. I really enjoyed our last conversation.
It's a real pleasure, John. Yeah, it's great to have a scholar and a friend of wisdom seekers such as yourself back. And I really enjoyed that conversation. A lot of people reached out to me afterwards, seemed to resonate with it. I ended up having a conversation with your Discord community.
Yeah.
And, you know, a friend who I just had on SENSESPACE, Joseph Pickens, who you might not know yet, but he reached out to me after the conversation as well. And we really clicked on our backgrounds in a meaningfully synchronous way. So,
well, that's good news. I'm glad that our conversation afforded you so many good connections. That's great to hear.
So, a little different from our last conversation, which was totally no sort of agenda.
Right.
There's a couple of things I talked about when I reached out to you. One of which was to kind of build on our last conversation where we explored dialectic, and sort of building on your work. I've been exploring a lot about the dialectical nature of being, of reality.
Right.
And that's become a sort of a way of understanding at a lot of different lenses and levels of experience. And sort of one of the fruits of that has been this idea of the meta practitioner.
Right.
With, and seeing how we can, I feel the ideas about trauma and logos are somehow going to interact in here as well. So
sure.
We're going to thread all the pieces together, and I'm going to try and remember that I don't know where it's going. And be listening for something that I haven't heard yet.
Sure. I suppose maybe a good place to start is some work that I've recently done with Christopher Mastropietro. Two pieces of work. One is we edited and contributed to an anthology called Internet of Dialogues, which is at the publishers right now. And so there was a lot there, a lot of reflection on dialectic into Dialogos and what's going on there. And then more recently, we've submitted an article seeking publication about the relationship between dialectic as a practice and the ability to overcome nihilism. And we were using that framework to integrate some of the fundamental insights about the dialectical nature of being, drawn from the Neoplatonic tradition, and the work of the Kyoto school, especially Nishitani, about overcoming nihilism. And as you can imagine, this could get very, very airy and abstract very quickly. So I'll try and keep it as basic as possible. And the idea is dialectic is a practice that at many levels and in sort of increasing disclosure helps you to overcome sort of the subject-object divide, the way in which consciousness normally is egocentrically oriented, and we have sort of an Aristotelian logic where identities are just A equals A kind of identity, and that's our sort of normal everyday cognition. And what Nishitani argued is that as long as we're within that framework, two things are bound to happen together. We're bound to eventually hit nihilism because we're going to find ourselves thrown towards a kind of absolute skepticism or solipsism. But it won't throw us hard enough. It won't throw us clear from it because we'll still stay entrenched within that sort of cultural cognitive grammar. And what Nishitani proposed is we need to know how to doubt so deeply that we can actually doubt the cognitive cultural grammar that throws us into nihilism, that egocentric subject-object, Aristotelian logic state of mind, sort of a monoculture, a monologue of cognition. And what Chris and I were arguing is that the practice of genuine dialectic in the Socratic form, because it gets you to confront aporia, to put it sort of a little bit of a slogan, the way you get into the great doubt is by really opening up Socratic wonder. And Socratic wonder in the practice of dialectic, and when it becomes dialogos, when it takes on a life of its own, and both people get drawn beyond themselves, they get drawn into a process that's outside their own individual egocentric perspectives. They're open to identifying with someone and a view other than themselves, and then internalizing it, and then going through a process of self-transcendence in which they other from themselves and then re-identify. So they're breaking standard Aristotelian logic. I mean, even Hegel saw that with respect to the dialectic, but not as a conceptual thing, as a thing that's going on at the level of their lived, perspectival participatory engagement and identity formation, etc. And so we argued that the dialectic can, if it taps deeply into its Socratic roots and its Neoplatonic culmination, can actually give us this higher order practice by which we can challenge the fundamental cultural cognitive grammar of nihilism. And we can turn the nothingness of nihilism into the no-thingness of non-duality and shunyata, which opens us back up to the deepest kind of connections we can have at the procedural and the perspectival and the participatory level. So the argument is that we have the potential by doing something which, right, because the Kyoto School was already trying to bridge East and West, right? We have the potential for creating through this very cross-cultural cross-cultural theoretical integration, an understanding of the process, the practice of dialectic into dialogos that would help us give people a genuine reason and to have hope that they have a response to nihilism that actually takes in practice, that takes in that is going to be found within the process of them meeting other people, going through development, internalizing other perspectives, exapting our fundamental cognitive and developmental machinery. So we think that it's plausible that dialectic into dialogos is going to be not in our particular version, but the family of these practices that are emerging so prevalently right now in the West. I think they can be put into, sorry for the pun, into dialogue with both our own Socratic Neoplatonic roots and with the cross-cultural work done by the Kyoto School to give us a deep response to the ongoing trauma that we experience and label as nihilism. So it takes nihilism, I mean, this is going to piss the nihilists off. It takes nihilism even more, it's going to piss off the nihilists, because what we do is, and what Nishitani argues, and this is how he argues against Nietzsche and others, is the nihilists don't take the nothingness far enough. They don't take the nothingness far enough. They don't have the machinery that literally encourages us, enwraps us in wonder, so that we can realize, do it like a fundamental aspect shift. We can realize the nothingness as the no-thingness that, was at the center of, you can see sort of at the center of Zen, and therefore at the center in many ways of Taoism and Buddhism. So that's the argument. That's what we've been currently working on.
Awesome. There was a lot there.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Part of what I'm realizing and exploring this idea of a meta practitioner and kind of drawing on some of the conversations you've had around, what might be a kind of shamanic sort of polymath type role to respond to the contemporary meaning crisis, which you've kind of, for people who don't know, you have been the sort of main articulator and sort of expanding on the depth and history of why the crisis of meaning today is quite deep and unique. So part of that is sort of coming to try and sort of translate and put what you're telling me into dialogue with all of these other conversations that I'm having.
Totally.
And part of that move that I sort of realized over the last few months was that I was sort of speaking to teachers, sages, people that I was really drawn to speak to, but I wasn't really engaging horizontally as much. So the move that I've recently been exploring is just sort of putting myself out there into certain like communities just for practicing this
Excellent.
this sort of dialectic with people. And what you come up against very quickly when you're doing that is nobody knows what the fuck dialectic means. And they don't have a relationship with Socrates. And I don't have a huge relationship with Socrates except through your work. So
that's something we've lost in the West, right? We used to have a very extensive relationship. It's a funny thing, though. You're right, totally, Jacob. You meet and you try to, and that's why we're doing all this work. If what you described wasn't the case, there would be no need for the work, right? But the thing is, and Chris and I wrote about this. There's this weird other thing, this phenomenological thing is once people get into it, like with it, and they learn how to start doing it, and they'll say things like, oh, they act like I always like. There's this weird anamnesis, right? Oh, yes, I always knew that this is what I was always looking for. They act like, and I don't mean they act as if they're seeming. There's no pretense involved. They're authentically saying, right. This has always been here in some sense, but I didn't really know. And so what we tried to do is try to articulate people, well, where does dialectic come from in relationship to everyday conversation? Like, what is the relationship between just everyday discourse, everyday discussion, and full-blown dialectic? And so that's also what we tried to articulate in the paper, because we think that there is a deep continuity. I think the deep continuity is the best way to explain these two, what seem like opposite results. People, like you said, don't know what the heck they're supposed to be doing. And then once they start doing it, it's like they turn on and right, and they do all this. I feel like I'm coming home, and get all this religious language, often from very secular, otherwise skeptical people about this process and what's going on. And so I think that the best way to account for that is that there's a deep continuity between what's going on in dialectic and what's going on in just everyday discussion. And you just have to, we worked out sort of a hierarchical model about the relationship between discussion, debate, and dialectic in order to try and articulate that relationship. So, maybe I'll just say what it is briefly. So the idea is, and it makes use of a lot of the work of a philosopher at the foundation of a branch of linguistics called Pragmatics, which is Grice. And so the central insight of Grice is, and there's an episode where I do this in the series, is we always have to be conveying much more than we can say. Because if we try to put in everything we're conveying into our words, we get like this explosion, a combinatorial explosion of everything we're trying to say. We just get into this infinite regret of trying to. So what we rely on is a lot of non-propositional
especially
process.
as an academic.
Yeah, exactly, especially as an academic. But so what happens, Grice talked about, like, we have a basic maximum that we're cooperating. And so what happens is, if you were to say, excuse me, I'm out of milk, right? I don't think that you want to lactate, for example. And I don't think that you are expecting me to have milk right on my person, right? And I make all these assumptions that you mean the milk of a cow and that you want to consume it, right? And you want it in a container. You don't want me to throw it on your face, right? And we know all those expectations are there, because if I violate any one of them, you're surprised and angry, right? And we got a sense of how much milk you're asking of me. You're probably maybe asking for a cup or a container. If I give you a drop or I give you a truckload, it's like, wait, that's not what I was asking for. So there's all of this machine that we're always conveying more than we're saying. Now, in everyday discussion, that's against a background, right? A shared background of cooperation. Now, what happens is, right, we can come to a place where we realize that we're not in agreement about something, that we may have beliefs that are contrasting to each other. So we move to the level of debate. And then what we do there is we carry on the debate until we hopefully get to some resolution where we can get back to cooperation. And then we go back to just being able to discuss and live our social lives. And we have thought for a very long time, like our society's paid attention to those two levels a lot. Problem we're facing now is, what do you do when, right, the higher order, so even when we're debating, there's a higher order assumption of cooperation. There's a shared model of rational normativity. What happens when that's undermined? You can't debate your way through that. So if you're up against a nihilist, right, you're going to try and debate with them. You're going to try and invoke, you need to play by these rules, of the rules of debate. And they're going to go, they're going to throw some, very trenchant skepticism, or they're going to withdraw into a kind of solipsism. And then you're going to, and if you stay in debate, right, you're not going to get any resolution. And then what you have to do is you have to move to the level of dialectic. And dialectic is, how do we get back? What do we do to reconform ourselves to each other and to the world, so that we once again get a shared sense of cultural cognitive normativity? We get a shared culture of how we're going to interact with each other, so that we can then drop back down to the level of debate, so we can resolve our theoretical disputes and drop back down to the level of living our lives. And so the thing about dialectic is, you only get there after these other levels have come into question. But you're still using the same machinery. You're still ultimately relying on the pragmatics. Even in everyday discussion, remember what I said, most of how I'm giving meaning to you is in terms of what I'm conveying, not what I'm saying. And as you go up the level, it goes more and more into that. When you get to the level of dialectic, it's purely pragmatic. You're just trying to convey to each other, so that you get back into communing with each other, so that the communication needed for debate is possible, so that debate can be resolved and put us back into everyday discussion. And so when you're engaging in dialectic, although you're using propositions, the pragmatics is way more important than the propositions. The propositions are basically vehicles by which we try to become aware of how we are trying to convey and co-create a new kind of shared intelligibility, so that we can come together and we can actually effectively debate each other instead of in an adversarial process. It's very much like, many people have said what's going wrong, or the difficulties facing the United States right now is debate has died, because both parties have lost a shared overarching commitment to America and to democracy. They don't have the shared normativity anymore. They're not moving in the same cultural space at all. And the debate mechanism doesn't work for resolving that. It just gridlocks. And what people are looking for, incoherently mostly, is, how do we get back to the place where we share something, we share the space in which we are willing to debate again in a fruitful and functional fashion, rather than gridlocking, so that we can solve those problems, so that we can get back down to just talking to each other and living our lives again. So that's the basic argument in a nutshell.
I really want to draw out this aspect of embodying the thing that you're communicating, rather than it existing on the propositional level.
So I apologize. I mean, I don't like to do this. I'm getting in a bit of a performative contradiction here. I mean, I'm talking all about conveyance and embodiment and, the co-creation through communing rather than just speaking. and listening as much as speaking, and opening up to the other as much as, and all I did was present a treatise to you. So I welcome this. We need to shift back into, yes, well, like let's try and do it with each other.
Mm-hmm. So there's something about this quality of dialectic, which perhaps, if you were to encounter a Socrates or a Jesus or a Buddha on the road, he's quite unlikely to announce to you, his scholarly or religious authority. I think the way that, or the shaman for that matter, or the meta practitioner or whatever it is, shows up relationally always and contextually, because they're embodying this spirit of dialectic. So I'm not going to come into a conversation with any given person with a totally prefixed agenda of where I want it to go. And the underlying orientation has to be towards greater ease, friendship, a sense of a shared inquiry towards truth, which of course necessitates a sense that truth is a possibility, and something that we can experience in the same way they experience beauty in the world. And so in order to show up in this way, as I am, doing the work of attempting to do now, making myself available to people, jumping into these conversations for an hour or 90 minutes with no idea really where it's going to go, I feel I'm honing somehow this skill set, and especially in a context where we don't necessarily, the topic of dialogos and what that is, this notion of a sort of emergent truth and an intimacy in relationship to a kind of felt sense of mystery coming between two people. That doesn't get named until there's a sense of demonstrating it, I guess.
I mean, so this is where the distinction between the language of explaining and the language of trading is really important. What I was doing a few minutes ago was explaining it to you, because what theory is supposed to help us see, but it's not the same thing as doing it. I mean, when you're entering into this process, typically what you do is you do practices just to get a flowing intimacy going, and you shift people out of, it's a sequence of practices you do. You basically try to get people into a collective flow state where they are flowing with each other. There's the back and forth between them, but you also try to get them, and this goes back to the earlier point. You have to shift them. I don't want it to sound so manipulative, but that's the best language I have right now. You're trying to get them out of that egocentric orientation that's locking them in. You're trying to get them to be open to being coupled to the process. So what's emerging? As you said, you're trying to get people. So for me, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to get people to cooperate, to wonder together. Remember, I was saying that's how you get people to confront what is beyond. You try to get people into a state of insight, but not the kind of insight in which we're going to get an answer. It's the kind of insight that opens up the wonder even more, so that we start co-wondering together. We start wandering together over the landscape of intelligibility, and we help each other to see what we couldn't see before, but we're also encouraging each other. Your presence helps me deal with the threat, because I have a sense that you're there for me. if, if this gets a little too, ooh, that's because, if you push, if you call too much into question too quickly, people get like, right? But also, if you don't call enough into question, people get satisfied. They get self-satisfied. We have a good term for that, right? And so you're trying to get this optimal grip, this sweet spot of co-wondering, where you and I are mutually affording, wandering over the landscape of intelligibility, seeing what we couldn't see before. And because of your encouragement of me, I'm more liable to see the emergence as something beautiful or maybe awe-inspiring, rather than horrifying or threatening or defensive. And hopefully I am doing the same for you. I am affording you to wander, right, and encouraging you, so that emerging sense. And here's the thing, right? If we start to get into that and we're playing with it, rather than trying to bring back things that we're going to tell our friends later or whatever, and we all do this, whatever egocentric narcissism is at work. But if we can also get to a place where the presence of that process of beautiful emerging intelligibility, we start to do it for its own sake, and we start to love it for its own sake. And what that does, and there's no words that can do it, this shifts you from seeing reality in this sort of hard subject object thing, way, and it opens you up to the presencing out of no-thingness, right? Because, like you said, that's another word for mystery. That where does this keep coming from? Where does all this moreness and where does all this intelligibility keep coming from? And it seems to have this life of its own that's beyond you and me. And if we can get to that place where we can sense that and find it awe-inspiring and beautiful rather than terrifying and threatening, we can come to internalize it, identify it with it, and then we're outside of the very framework that traps us into that kind of adversarial position. And so now when I want to talk to you, that's what I mean. I want to shift into this is what you want to do to get into the practice. There's a big difference between this is what you do to understand what it might mean as a cognitive scientist, right? And how it might be relevant to nihilism. But how do we do it? Well, that's what we do, right? And so I have to sensitize myself to the superlative, right? Because if I experience the loss of all of this structure, just as the collapse of being, I will experience this process as privation, as loss, as nihilism, right? Porphyry calls it the collapse of being, right? But if I can sensitize myself to the very same process as superlative, as going beyond being and pointing me to that from which being constantly emerges, then the nothingness, I can experience it. We can experience it together, which makes it even more real, right? I can experience that as no-thingness. I can experience that as the permanent, real possibility of a new shared culture and cognition that allows us to recommune together.
So there's something really important that's been coming out of your dialogues, which has been this exploration, not just of dialectic as we've talked about it, but that the embodiment of that understanding of dialectic actually means being in dialectic, in conversation, we can say more accessibly, in conversation between experience and dialectic.
Yeah, totally.
So both in the sense of I want to now reconnect my experience with the dialectic we're having, but also in the course of my listening to you, I'm attempting to hold this dialectic between what's coming up for me in my brain and what I want to say next, and then coming back out to you,
Yep. Yep.
and
Yep.
to not within the first few moments have figured out what I want to say and now be in a state of waiting for you to finish
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
can say it.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
listening. There's almost a total entanglement of listening and dialectic, because in order
Yeah.
to be embodying it, we're listening constantly
Yeah. Yeah. Keep going.
to this dialectic occurring both within ourselves, and then, part of my sort of playful expansion on this in the last few weeks has been to consider how we are, how this kind of maps onto all of the most important aspects of our lives. For example, our most meaningful relationships can be considered a dialectic or a conversation that occurs over a long period of time
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
you and your partner, the parent and the child. The relationship that you have, and that I've recently discovered since I actually moved to Berlin since we last spoke. I was in Athens.
Right.
I followed my intuition to visit a woman in Berlin that I've been talking with, and now thankfully in a lovely relationship with. So
Congratulations.
thank you. Yes, it's a happy occurrence of this year, and somehow somehow faith affirming in reality, I guess, that I should create this. We'd met a year before, but she actually got in touch with me when I produced the first episode of SENSESPACE and put it up.
Oh,
Connected
wow.
me.
Wow.
So, and what was really interesting, I've been in this men's group that I connected through Rebel Wisdom, talking about men's experience and trauma, but really in a way that doesn't sort of focus on trauma in isolation, but actually is a kind of opening up of possibility space.
Right.
It's
Right.
been
Right.
really awesome. And Andre Pellegrini, who runs it, who's really brilliant, he reflected to me like sense space. That kind of sounds like the opposite of trauma.
Oh, good.
And so
That's
I was, I think I spoke to you about this the first time we met, but I really got into dialectic. I got into engaging outwardly with the world more with this, out of being in the meaning crisis,
Yep.
at the deepest, most embodied level possible. And so here we are.
Can I ask you a question then?
Mm-hmm.
Because this, right? This, well, there's several questions I want to ask. Well, let's ask the first one. This, because I think there's a part of this that's really important, and it was lacking in what I've previously said, and I think, and it really points to the nexus of embodiment. Because you talked about sort of, if you'll allow me to use some directional metaphors, you talked about sort of the internal up and down between sort of the conceptual and the perceptual. If you'll, right, you're moving back and forth between, right, how you're thinking and then how you're actually coupling to the world. So there's this, but you said that's sort of a vertical dimension, right? You're right, and then you talked about the horizontal between us, and then I think you said something really, really important: keeping those two, right, in sync with each other, so they stay in touch with each other. So you sort of optimally balance between them. That to me, that's the crucial. That's the crucial thing. That's the point of the most authentic embodiment and engagement and enactment. So what does it, sorry, I don't mean to sound therapeutic, but what does it feel like when those are in sync? Because you brought it up. And what does it feel like when they're out of sync?
Mm-hmm.
How are you feeling your way through that? And of course, I don't mean just tingly feelings in your body. I mean as much your conceptual awareness, your preemptive awareness, right? Your inactive awareness, your perceptual awareness. What does it feel like when they're in sync? And what does it feel like when they're out of sync?
Okay, this is hopefully going to come out nicely. Somehow connect with the Christianity thing that we were riffing on before.
That's fine. That's fine.
So there's something important about dropping into, Zach talks about pre-tragic, post-tragic.
Zach Stein? Zach
Yeah,
Stein?
Zach Stein. Connecting with trauma can actually be the movement from a greater disconnection from self to a move into a process which is affording of a deeper connection to self. So, and I've been, in this work for about a year and a half or more, and so it's been a very important aspect of my life, and it's been actually where most of my insights and a sense of a kind of there's a sort of axis of movement into embodiment where it feels as if you're getting closer and closer to the physicality of experience. And it's very difficult to not start using languages like energy or energetically when we get into this, because the state of trauma I've ultimately found as a state of fragmentation.
Yes.
And so that fragmentation tells you, you experience it as a contraction of your reality, sort of shrinking in, as you sort of showed with your hands. But there's also a narrative contraction as well, and a sort of incapacity to perceive that you rest within a process. You are now defined by this state of fragmentation that you're in. And there's a kind of a story that you're telling yourself, and you are in dialogue with your body always, I believe, when you are in the process of trauma integration. So there's something about there is an art, I guess, which for me, a lot of it has been to do with the compulsion to connect more, the compulsion to come into a deeper relationship with creativity, and the capacity to have enough trust in relationship that someone else can then communicate to you when you are in the state of fragmentation. And so I began to wonder whether my view of trauma to be fully integrated necessitated that trauma itself be on an axis in relationship to, we can talk about what it might be, but something like creativity or greater connection with world. And so I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. So let me see if I'm understanding you. So it sounds like what you're saying is, right, part of it is that you're moving from a sense of being fragmented within yourself to being sort of more connected to yourself. And that is also expressing itself in, right, a movement towards sensing an increased connection to other people, in the sense not just of what's happening in the moment, but also in a sense of a more permanent, a sense of a more permanent possibility that it's emerging in you. Like you're getting a sense of, I could be more connected than I am. I could be more in connection to others than I am. And is that what, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong here, but I thought I heard you saying that sense that you're moving towards overcoming inner fragmentation and affording more real connection to others. That sense is a kind of trust in you, but because the process is like, it's creative. Do you mean that it's growing, but it's growing in a way that it keeps pace with your ability to make sense of it? Because I could imagine stuff emerging and it would be like, that's not creativity, right? creativity is appropriate novelty, right? So there's novelty coming up, but you can appropriate it. I'm not saying it's painless. I'm not trying to paint it with rose-colored glasses, but it sounds to me like what you've got is that you've got a sense of, well, I would call it like encouragement, trust in the creativity, because you've got something going on here where this connection and this connection are reliably now starting to support each other, talk to each other. And it keeps taking you a step further out of the cave, but it keeps helping you adjust your eyes to the new things you're seeing. Is that, am I overreading it? Am I underreading it? Am I misreading what you're saying?
Okay, this might go in an unexpected direction, but I have a sense that in the process of coming into confrontation or awakening to, or we can consider that part of what awakened in me when my dropping into deep experiences and trauma opened me up to the world was a deeper relationship with nature.
Right.
In which I observed the repetition of branching patterns throughout the natural world, throughout the human body, and also in man-made structures, like, if you look at the Roman roads of Europe. And so there's something that I found incredibly meaningful and a source of solace in that. And as I continued to return to it, as it became an aspect of my being, which gave me meaning in the context of the meaning crisis, my thought became more informed by these patterns. And I allowed that to take place. And there's a deep wisdom within these patterns. And so my first sort of foray into articulating that has been that the landscape of trauma, best term I could come up with, that we can understand the nature of the self and the nature of trauma by an understanding and relationship to these branching patterns.
Yes.
So the self, I see John as a single individual, but actually John is constituted by, he's the trunk of the tree, and actually he's also the roots going out into the soil, and that soil, thicker branches is your upbringing, your parents, your grandparents, meaningful interactions, and then down to smaller and smaller. And then I played further with it, and I said that the circumstance we arrive at in adulthood may well be that we have certain branches which are illuminated to us and certain branches which are in shadow. This is trauma. It's disconnection from aspects of self and experience which actually constitute you. So the process of moving from pre-tragic to post-tragic, the process of attaining deeper levels of wisdom and relationship to reality, I would suggest, is of coming into awareness and then connecting those roots into world. And so the more parts of self that you integrate, the more sort of branches that your tree needs to have. And so if you were living a very sort of constricted, narrow, and pointed life, where you just did the same thing over and over again, like working a dull office job, actually getting the opportunity, which many people in our society don't have, to step out of that in the way that would allow you to drop in to those deeper disconnections. You might need to change the way that you're being in order to be in relationship with these fuller aspects of self. And so for me, it's been, not doing kinds of, work and a relationship to work that's traumatizing to me because it's not actually in connection with my body. Discovering drawing, discovering music, discovering connection, And I think we have to begin to find the way in which this becomes our superpower, so to speak. That, you know, initially when you drop into this, you're going to be naked and incredibly sensitive energetically in ways that people who haven't been through this process will not understand. But your sensitivity to the energetics of people and environments become incredibly heightened.
Yes.
Part of that is because your body is in anticipation or fear of the thing that traumatized you. But in the process of integrating that, you don't lose those sensitivities. You integrate them now, and you learn how to have proper boundaries. And so maybe you can see how this might connect with our thread of Christianity, where I feel we have something about a community being created and a narrative that we can all hold fast to.
Yeah.
But something about a deep embodied reckoning with the historical inheritance of trauma Christianity has not been fit to respond to. And then something about boundaries as well in there as well. Like you often come out of a religious context with a different relationship to boundaries, because the relationships in the church or something are not so well developed in that respect.
What you said was just so beautiful. So when you talked about the walking in nature, so Nishitani defines the essence of religion. He's not talking about it historically or dogmatically. He calls it the self-realization of reality. So when you went out and you saw the branching pattern simultaneously without and within, and that pattern was not objective or subjective, but transjective. And you realized as you're realizing that pattern, it's realizing itself in you. That's what Nishitani means. That's that moment. That's that moment. And that's that moment, you know, we talk about in dialectic, where you're getting that conformity. The pattern within and the pattern without are resonating, and they're opening you up. And then I noticed that in your metaphor, you're foregrounding the rooting, but you've got, which is the emergence, right, upward. But you've got sunlight in your metaphor, right? And that's the emanation. The sunlight is the illumination, the intelligibility. Well, that's how I'm feeling it, right? And because you talked about, it's in the shadow, which means you can't see it, you can't make sense of it, and it's threatening, and so again, you're doing this, the image, right? It's like an icon for you, and it's not a metaphor. That's the thing, right? You're not literally saying that everything's a tree. That's ridiculous. You're not just speaking a metaphor, because you're saying, no, like it's neither literal nor metaphorical. It's beyond them. It's participatory, right? You're seeing that you and the trees are both like in a literal, we say A equals A, right? In a metaphor, we say, think of B as A. But what you're actually saying is A and B both point upward or downward, whatever metaphor you want, right, to something that they both participate in. The branching in me and the branching out there in the world are both, siblings of the branching of reality, the way reality realizes itself. And you use this dropping into metaphor about you're getting in sync with that lower connectivity. That's why you use the roots, right? Because they sink in, right? And they reach into the ground and they draw nourishment from it. But you're all right. It's just, do you see what you do what you learn to do in dialectic? One of the things you do is you learn to celebrate these iconic images, right? That are neither literal nor metaphorical, but are iconic and participatory. And you try and get people to move into them, like the way you did spontaneously. You inhabited it, you relived it, and you were opening it up. And then, like what I did with you, I would say, but what about the sunlight? Tell me more about the sunlight. in your icon. So, Jacob, tell me more about the sunlight in your icon. Because it's there. What's it doing?
It's it's utterly confounding, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
It's well, it starts out with the relief of being in safety,
right.
ultimately in relationship, and then from there, uh, there's a certain sort of letting go that can then be a fully participating.
Right.
Um, and what I wanted to sort of riff to throw on that, because we talk so much about logos and how with this dialectic we're eventually reaching a dialogos.
Yeah.
I believe that nature, or in particular these branching patterns, and what they convey to us is kind of the logos of nature, but perhaps not just nature, reality itself.
Right.
And so we don't just look at we don't just take this branching pattern to the self and to the past. We take it out into the world as well. And we say to individuals with these branching patterns, why is it that traumatized people continually find the person that corresponds with their trauma? Why
Right.
does
Right.
someone who has a fear of being attacked or something, I've seen this many times, particularly with women, continually attract the predator who
Yeah.
somehow is energetically detecting this? The dark side of this is that there's a certain inevitability in our trauma that we're not conscious of finding its partner. But the beauty of it is to understand that somehow, as we move through each relationship and play these things out, that the logos of the trauma itself is to come to be resolved through relationship.
So
Uh,
is the light then the understanding that's available from the logos? Like just try to feel the light. Like in your metaphor, you looked up, you did this, right? You did this, and you opened your hands like a branching tree, and you opened your eyes. What are you looking up to?
I'm looking at the stars, John.
Yeah.
I'm going out at night and I'm finding the spots where the street lights don't block out the sky, and I'm looking up at the stars, and then I'm
And what
coming
does that
home.
convey to you? What does that convey to you when you're looking at the stars? Like, how do you become different than you normally are when you're looking at the stars?
It's bliss. It's a kind of bliss, and it's it's sort of emanating out of your. You can feel it on your whole exterior.
Yeah.
It's a deep participatory sort of feeling, um, and you start like as you do this dance between experience and narrative, and you
Yeah.
play all of these reciprocal games. The fruit of it is more artfulness. Your
Yeah.
conversation becomes more artful, and hopefully if you're doing what I'm calling meta practitioner, you're not just doing dialectic, you're exploring a whole suite of different
Yeah.
practices with an expanded notion, such that inquiry into nature, inquiry into music, trying something you didn't know how to do before, um, all of these things come within the remit of deeper participation with world, and you're finding wisdom and you're listening,
Right. Right.
all different sort of dimensions.
Like the tree branching out into the light. That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. How do you feel sort of connecting those two images together, those two icons, looking at the star and being the tree? Like you were enacting both of them together. How do they resonate with each other inside of you?
Feels really good, John. Feels like I'm right where I should be. I know you've got to jump off in a minute, but I think I'm going to be feeling pretty blissed out and glowed up for having discussed these beautiful topics with you afterwards.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful, and I thank you. That was courageous. I thank you for indulging me, because we moved between theory, the discussion, and then we moved into theoria, the actual contemplative practice of doing dialectic, right, and getting into like really unfolding and unpacking, you know. And notice how we keep trying to say what we can ultimately only convey, and we keep doing that. And what it does is it enlivens us, it awakens us, and it gets us right to what you said. Like people, they shift. They do this they're capable of this fundamental shift from a sense of privation to a sense of what's superlative, what is beyond, like the stars. And I think that is ultimately how people can respond to nihilism. I do have to jump, Jacob. I want to do this again with you. I want to follow up. I think this is an excellent second video, right? Because the first one was more background, and then this one we're getting sort of the two sides of the theory and the theoria together, right? And then we can then maybe next time come together and explore, because we have a lot of branches that we didn't get to climb out on. You know, you want to talk more about the connections to Christianity, and I'd love to do that with you.
Awesome, John. And maybe we can see about getting a third conversation player in here and really get going in the pot.
That would be fantastic. I'm very open to that. I love doing three-way dialogue.
Awesome. Great to have you on, John. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Me too. Let's make sure we set something up.
Great.
Okay, I got to jump. Take good care.
Thank you.
That was really wonderful. So vibrant and vital. Thank you.